For our Pro Tools assignment of task 2, we had to create a 1:10 to 1:30 piece of audio, only using 8 seconds worth of samples. For this, I used a drum loop of 4 seconds, and a synth loop that was also 4 seconds long. Both of these were exported from Propellerhead's Reason. For the beginning of my track, I wanted it to have as if there was a filter opening from the synth line, so for this I used an EQ 7-band filter that gradually opened using automation. For the last 4 seconds of this, I introduced a kick drum that was heavily compressed to give a strong sounding sound, with added EQ to find the dominant frequency within the kick drum, and this was raised at about 70 Hz. For the next piece of the track, I wanted to introduce another synth line that was pitched up 1 octave, just to give a stronger sounding of the synth. To build up to the next section of the piece, a time structure sample and added loads of effects with this. For this, I used TCE looping. I used a lot of reverb for this, so it would give me a lasting effect with the noise. I then used a channel strip EQ to cut out both the lower end and the higher end frequencies of this. I used an enhancer after that, and then I added a maxim, which is a limiter, to add a radio limiter to this. To add to the lasting effect even further, I then added a multi-delay, which was only introduced about 20% into the mix. After that, I added another reverb to push us back behind the synth line that was playing to build up to the next section. The synth line was the next main focus of my track. For this, I used automation and EQ. I drew this in using the triangle draw line, and I wanted to sound as if there was a filter opening and closing all the time. And as you can see here, it gradually cuts off the higher end frequencies and opens up the lower end. I also introduced my drums for this section, and that was looped over the 8 bars of the track. For this section, I also reversed a kick drum, which laid over the top of the drums as well to give an effect and added it to the drums even further. For this section, the synth line is going for a filter gate, which is set so it holds a 16th note pattern at 100%. Behind this, in the background, there's a synth line that's been EQ'd so the lower end of the frequencies aren't as prominent, and it's mainly the higher end of this. I've also put this through a filter gate as well, so it adds to the effect of that. For this section, I've also used the same drums, but I've reversed some parts to make it seem a little bit more interesting. For this section, the synth line is introduced back in, with some parts are reversed, and this adds a little more detail to the original synth line. For this section, I used the original synth sample. I cut different snippets from the synth line and added it over the top of it. This gave the synth line a different rhythm to what it usually had. I also introduced the white noise sound back in that I created from the time stretched loop, along with another filter gated synth that was EQ'd so it only held the higher end frequencies. For the next section of my track, I then added in another version of a filter gated synth with EQ that changes the pattern of the rhythm. I added a bit of delay onto this as well, so it added to that rhythm a bit more. For the second part of this, I then used vary speed to slow down this gradually, and this would then lead me on to the next section. To build up to the next section even more, I added a snare fill that I duplicated over a bar and automated the volume of this with some added reverb to extend the tail. For the next part, I then cut the original synth and made it so only every note would play. I added lots of reverb and delay onto this as I felt this would give the effect that I wanted. I added in the kick drum sample on the beat as this added to the effect too. I also used a reverse kick drum to work alongside this. After building up through the sections, I then introduced the original 4-second sample of the synth and played this along with the other ones that I'd created from changing the filter gates. I gradually faded out the instruments, which then went back to the gated and EQ'd synth, and finally ended up with a sample